What if I told you that one of the most important men in the Bible didn't part seas, slay giants, or perform miracles, but spent a night wrestling in the dark with God himself? Yeah, you heard that right. Jacob wasn't the obvious choice. He wasn't the strongest, the eldest, or the most righteous. He was a man full of flaws, fears, and contradictions. A deceiver, a runner, a man who limped for the rest of his life after one divine encounter. And yet, God chose him to become the father of a nation. This isn't just a Bible story. This is your story. The story of wrestling with identity, struggling with the past, waiting for a promise that seems too far, loving deeply, failing loudly, rising slowly. Jacob's life is raw, relatable, and prophetic, because in his brokenness, we see the blueprint of grace. And here's the part no one talks about. The very things we try to hide, our mistakes, our weakness, our confusion, may be the very places where God shows up the strongest. What if your greatest breakthrough isn't in your strength, but in your surrender? This video will walk you through the real story of Jacob, not the Sunday school version, but the layered, messy, miraculous journey of a man who went from heel grabber to nation builder. You'll laugh, reflect, and probably see yourself in more than one chapter. So grab a seat, because by the end of this, you won't just know more about Jacob, you'll know more about the God who never gave up on him. From the very beginning, Jacob's story was anything but ordinary. Imagine being born holding your brother's heel. Yeah, literally. That one detail set the tone for everything that would come next. God was already writing something big, even before Jacob took his first breath. And sometimes, that's exactly how life works. Our purpose starts before we understand it. Now, Jacob wasn't the firstborn, but that didn't stop God from choosing him. In a culture where the eldest had all the perks, this shift was radical. God made it clear, the older would serve the younger. That was a divine curveball, breaking tradition and expectation. Ever feel overlooked? Maybe that's just the setup. Before your rise. See, the world has this obsession with the first, but God often works through the unexpected. Think about that friend who always gets picked last, but then outshines everyone in the game. That's Jacob. That's what makes his story so relatable. We all want to believe that purpose isn't about position. It's about promise. There's a lesson right there. Your current place doesn't define your final destination. Just like Jacob, many of us start behind. But God doesn't care where you start. He cares where he's taking you. That's where trust kicks in, big time. Jacob's birth wasn't just dramatic, it was prophetic. And not the kind of prophecy that sounds like thunder and lightning. No, it was subtle, woven into everyday life. Ever notice how some small things later turn out to be huge signs? Yeah, that was Jacob grabbing Esau's heel. Nothing random about that. And let's be real, family drama isn't new. Jacob's parents, Isaac and Rebekah, were already playing favorites. Esau was the rugged one, the hunter. Jacob? More reserved, quiet, but sharp. That contrast created tension, one that many of us feel when we're not like the rest. If you've ever felt different in your own home, Jacob gets you. His childhood wasn't a fairy tale. It was a battlefield of comparison. But instead of breaking him, it built him. God had his hand on Jacob, shaping him through tension, not comfort. That's how character is carved, under pressure. You know what's wild? Jacob's name literally means supplanter, one who takes the place of another. That name carried weight. Labels have power, and many of us live with names, nicknames, or judgments we never asked for. But Jacob's story proves those labels don't define you, God's calling does. Let me put it like this. If someone calls you lazy, broken, or not enough, remember, Jacob was called a deceiver, and still became Israel. It's not what people call you, it's what God declares over you that sticks. Your past doesn't cancel your potential, it prepares it. So here's a practical step. Reflect on the labels you've accepted. Write them down, then cross them out and replace them with what God says about you. Try reading Psalm 139. It'll reset your entire mindset. Jacob didn't become who he was by accident. He leaned into divine truth. This is just the opening chapter in Jacob's wild ride. Born into conflict, marked by prophecy and surrounded by chaos, yet chosen. That's what makes his story so powerful. And it's only getting started, because things are about to get even more intense between these two brothers. Jacob was never the kind to wait around for opportunity to knock. He'd rather build the door himself. One ordinary day, Esau came in from the fields, starving, and Jacob saw his moment. A simple bowl of stew became the currency of destiny. Sounds dramatic? Well, it was. And this moment was about much more than food. This deal might seem sneaky, but it exposed something deeper in both brothers. Esau, driven by impulse, traded something sacred for instant gratification. Jacob, on the other hand, understood the weight of a birthright, even if he didn't go about it the right way. Sometimes people lose treasures chasing cravings. Ever been there? Let's be honest. How often do we trade long-term purpose for short-term pleasure? We skip the workout for the couch, the prayer time for another scroll. That's an Esau move, but Jacob's story shows us that even flawed ambition can be directed by God. The key is to learn and grow beyond the mistake. Esau's hunger wasn't the real problem. It was what he valued. He saw his birthright as disposable, and that mindset cost him everything. In today's world, that looks like throwing away your calling for popularity or giving up your peace for someone else's approval. Heavy, right? But real. Jacob's strategy was far from holy, but it revealed his hunger for purpose. He didn't just want the blessing, he was desperate for it. Sometimes, that desperation for more is what pulls you into God's plan, even if it starts messy. Because let's face it, most of our stories start messy too. It's easy to judge Jacob for being manipulative. But before we do, we need to check our own hearts. How often do we try to negotiate our way into blessings? We make promises we don't keep, or we bend truth to get ahead. The lesson isn't about being perfect, it's about being aware. There's also something powerful about timing. Jacob didn't just act randomly. He was watching, waiting, calculating. And when the moment came, he moved. That kind of discernment can be a blessing or a curse. What we need is wisdom, knowing not just when to move, but how. Here's something practical. Start evaluating the deals you make daily. What are you saying yes to? What are you sacrificing in the process? Keep a journal for a week and track it. You might discover that some small choices are shaping your destiny more than you thought. Jacob's story in this scene is raw and real. He's not a hero yet, just a guy chasing purpose the only way he knows how. And God doesn't strike him down. That alone tells us something profound. God isn't afraid of our flaws. He works through them if we let him. At its core, this moment isn't just about deceit, it's about desire. Jacob wanted more from life, even if he didn't fully understand what more meant. That yearning is familiar to anyone who's ever felt stuck or overlooked. It's okay to want more. The challenge is how you go after it. So don't write yourself off because your methods weren't perfect. Jacob didn't. His journey was just getting started. And believe me, things are about to get a lot more complicated when blessings, disguises, and family dynamics collide in the next chapter of his unfolding story. Jacob's next move wasn't just bold, it was risky to the core. With his mother Rebekah's help, he disguised himself as Esau to fool his blind father, Isaac. Think about that. Wearing goat skins to mimic your brother's hairy arms? That's next-level commitment. It wasn't just trickery, it was a full-on performance. And it worked. But let's not be too quick to applaud. The blessing Isaac gave wasn't just a fatherly prayer, it was a spiritual inheritance. Wealth, leadership, divine favor, all passed down in one moment. Jacob wanted it all. He didn't just steal a sentence, he claimed a destiny, one that would cost him dearly. This part of Jacob's story shows us how far some people will go to secure a future. And let's be honest, desperation makes us brave or reckless. How often do we dress ourselves up, hide our real identity, just to fit someone's expectations? We wear masks too, don't we? Jacob wasn't just faking to win favor, he was hiding who he truly was. That's something a lot of us can relate to. We fake confidence, faith, even joy, hoping others won't see our doubts. But God doesn't bless the mask. He blesses the person behind it. Rebekah's role in all this is fascinating. She remembered God's prophecy that Jacob would lead. But instead of waiting for God's timing, she helped force the outcome. Sometimes we think we're helping God when really we're just rushing him. That usually ends in fallout. Have you ever tried to speed up your blessing? Sent that risky text? Took that job you weren't at peace with? Yeah, we've all been there. The problem isn't desire, it's distrust in God's timing. Jacob's story warns us, the right thing at the wrong time still brings consequences. Isaac, though blind, felt something was off. That voice, it didn't sound like Esau. But he doubted his instincts. That's a wake-up call. Sometimes, even when the outside looks right, the inside tells a different story. Trust that inner voice. It might just be God nudging you. Now, let's be real. Jacob did get the blessing. But what came next? Fear, exile, separation from everything. He knew. That's what deception does. It gives temporary gain with long-term cost. Ask yourself, is what you're chasing worth what you might lose? There's a practical gem here. Authenticity over approval. You don't need to lie to be blessed. You need to be aligned. Take time to sit with that. Ask yourself what roles you're playing that don't belong to you. Then ask God to give you peace with who you really are. Jacob's story takes a dark turn here, but it also reveals a God who works even through chaos. That doesn't mean the deceit was okay. It means grace still showed up. Isn't that encouraging? Even when we mess it up big time, God doesn't walk away. He redirects. You can't outrun consequences, but you also can't outrun God's love. Jacob was now blessed but broken, rich in promise but poor in peace. Ever felt like that? When the win doesn't feel like a win? That's the tension Jacob carried as he fled the life he just deceived his way into. And as Jacob leaves home, the weight of the blessing and the burden of the lie travel with him. What comes next isn't safety or celebration. It's a wilderness moment, one that will change him forever. Jacob didn't leave home as a hero. He ran as a fugitive. Behind him, a furious brother, a heartbroken father, and a mess of lies. Ahead, unknown lands and uncertain futures. It wasn't the exit of a champion, but of a man caught in the fallout, of ambition. And yet God was just getting started with him. The wilderness has a way of stripping us down. No titles, no reputation, just us and our fears. Jacob walked alone, maybe for the first time, with nothing but his thoughts and the clothes on his back. But sometimes, isolation is the exact place God meets us. Alone doesn't mean abandoned. When night fell, Jacob found a stone for a pillow. Talk about uncomfortable. Yet in that moment of discomfort, God broke through. He saw a stairway reaching from earth to heaven, with angels ascending and descending. That wasn't a dream. It was a divine interruption. Heaven was reaching down. Let that sink in. Jacob didn't find God in a temple or at an altar. He found him in the dirt, under the stars, with a rock under his head. That should give us hope. If God can meet Jacob there, he can meet you anywhere. Yes, even in the middle of your mess. God spoke directly to Jacob in that dream. No condemnation, no lecture. Just a promise. I am with you. I will keep you. I will bring you back. Powerful words for a man on the run. God wasn't done with Jacob. He was claiming him, flaws and all. Ever felt like you've run too far or messed up too badly? Jacob's story says otherwise. God doesn't cancel people. He restores them. And sometimes, it takes a wilderness moment for us to hear him clearly. Stillness opens the ears of the soul. When Jacob woke up, he was shaken. Surely the Lord is in this place, and I didn't know it. That's deep. How many times do we miss God's presence because we're too focused on our problems? Jacob almost slept through the most important moment of his life. He marked that place and called it Bethel, meaning house of God. No building, no priest, just an encounter. That's the beauty of relationship over religion. You don't need perfect conditions to connect with God. You need an open heart and a willing spirit. Jacob made a vow there, not a bargain, but a step of surrender. If God will be with me, he begins. It was the beginning of his personal faith, not borrowed from Isaac or taught by Rebekah, his own. That's a game changer. Real transformation starts with personal revelation. Here's something practical. Find your Bethel. Not a church necessarily, but a place where you consistently meet with God. A walk in the park, a chair by the window, even your car in silence. Make space for divine encounters. You'll be surprised where he shows up. Jacob continued on his journey, but now with a promise in his pocket. He wasn't just fleeing anymore. He was being led. That changes everything. When you know God is with you, the road ahead doesn't feel so terrifying. It feels like a path to purpose. And as Jacob heads toward the unknown, something inside him has shifted. He's still imperfect, still Jacob. But something's different. The seed of transformation has been planted. And the next chapter of his story? Well, it's one filled with love, labor, and more layers of divine irony. Jacob arrived in a new land, and almost instantly, love hit him like a lightning bolt. Rachel. Her name alone could make his heart skip. One glance, and Jacob was ready to work 7 years for her hand, without blinking. That's not just love, that's commitment. But as he'd soon learn, love stories often come with unexpected chapters. Laban, Rachel's father, saw Jacob's passion and his opportunity. On the wedding night, under the veil and the shadows, Laban pulled a fast one. Leah, not Rachel, became Jacob's wife. Can you imagine waking up and realizing you married the wrong sister? That's betrayal at breakfast. Jacob's story turned into poetic irony. The deceiver was now the deceived. God has a way of letting us experience what we've done to others, not out of punishment, but for transformation. Ever been on the other side of your own behavior? That's a mirror moment, and it stings. But Jacob didn't run. He didn't quit. He rolled up his sleeves and worked another 7 years. That's 14 years of labor for the one he loved. Real love doesn't quit. When things get hard, it digs deeper. And in a world that celebrates instant results, Jacob's endurance stands out. Let's pause here, because some blessings take time. Maybe you're waiting on a promise, a dream, a breakthrough. Jacob shows us that waiting doesn't mean wasting. God was shaping him, even in the monotony. Sometimes faith looks like showing up every day, even when it feels repetitive. Rachel and Leah became more than wives. They were the beginning of legacy. Through them and their maidservants, Jacob fathered 12 sons. But this wasn't a perfect family. It was messy, competitive, and full of emotion. Sound familiar? Families today aren't so different. Each child born added layers to Jacob's journey. Joy, tension, hope, and heartbreak. God was building a nation, one diaper at a time. And yet, favoritism and rivalry crept in, just like in Jacob's own childhood. The past has a way of repeating itself unless we confront it. Leah, the unloved wife, craved Jacob's attention. Rachel, though loved, struggled with barrenness. Both women wrestled with their worth. Isn't that still true today? We compare, compete, and question our value based on what we lack. But Jacob's story teaches us, God sees the overlooked. Here's something real. You don't have to be someone's favorite to be chosen by God. Leah named her son Judah, and from Judah came King David, and eventually, Jesus. Talk about divine plot twists. Sometimes the people others overlook carry the greatest destinies. Jacob's household was growing, but so were the complications. Emotions ran high, and loyalty was tested. Life under Laban's roof was no fairy tale, it was a forge. And Jacob, he was being refined in the fire of love, labor, and daily lessons. The dream came with drama. You want something worthwhile? Be ready to fight for it, work for it, and grow through it. Jacob's 14 years weren't wasted. They were building something deeper than a marriage. They were crafting character. And the best part? God was silently orchestrating it all. As Jacob's family expanded, so did the weight of his calling. What started as a romantic pursuit had now become a divine construction site. And the next season? It's about to test his patience, his wisdom, and his ability to lead under pressure. Jacob's tent was no longer quiet. It was full of laughter, shouting, and the daily chaos of a growing tribe. 12 sons, 4 mothers, 1 house. That's not just a family. That's a recipe for rivalry. Jealousy simmered like soup on a slow flame. And yet, through that tension, God was weaving something eternal. It's hard enough to raise one kid with wisdom. Imagine juggling 12, each with their own personality, their own mother, and their own expectations. Jacob tried, but he also stumbled. His heart leaned heavily toward Joseph and Benjamin, sons of Rachel, and that favoritism echoed like thunder through the household. Let's talk about favoritism. It's not just unfair, it's destructive. It split Jacob's family just like it split his parents' home when he and Esau were kids. The cycle repeated. That's what happens when past wounds go unhealed. Hurt people don't just hurt people, they teach it to the next generation. Jacob loved deeply, but not always wisely. Giving Joseph the famous multicolored coat wasn't just a gift, it was a neon sign of preference. And the other brothers? They noticed. Resentment grew with every thread of that robe. Sometimes blessings we give to one can feel like rejection. To others, sibling rivalry turned dangerous. The brothers began plotting, not just against Joseph, but against the peace of the entire family. Ever lived in a house where silence speaks louder than words? Where glances are sharp and trust is scarce? Jacob's household knew that vibe all too well. Still, God's hand didn't leave the story. Even in dysfunction, his plan unfolded. That's the beauty of grace. It works through our mess, not just our victories. If your family isn't picture perfect, welcome to the legacy of Jacob. God doesn't need perfection to fulfill purpose. There's a practical truth here. What you don't heal, you hand down. Jacob's favoritism was a mirror of Isaac's. That silent comparison between sons, it never left. If you've seen this pattern in your own family, jealousy, unspoken tension, competition, it might be time to break the cycle. God was building a nation, but the foundation was cracked, and still, he didn't stop. That's how God works. He builds strong things from broken beginnings. Jacob's sons would become the 12 tribes of Israel, each with a role, a story, a destiny. Out of rivalry came royalty. Leah's children felt overlooked, but they carried strength. Rachel's sons carried dreams, but also burden. Each child brought something different to the table. Sometimes in our own lives, the less favored parts of our journey end up becoming the strongest pieces of our testimony. Jacob probably didn't realize how much his choices were shaping generations. That's the weight of leadership. Our actions echo. So here's something to reflect on. What echoes are you creating in your home, your friendships, your legacy? Every small act builds something bigger. The tension in Jacob's house wasn't just personal, it was prophetic. Because out of this family would come kings, prophets, and the Messiah himself. God wasn't choosing the most peaceful family, he was transforming the most chaotic one. And the story is just heating up. As seeds of envy and division take root, one moment is about to shift everything. One decision, one journey, one son's destiny will collide with betrayal, and that's where the next part of this story truly takes flight. While family tension brewed, Jacob's responsibilities grew. He was no longer just a father, he was a provider, a leader, and a steward of God's promises. Under Laban's watch, Jacob worked the flocks with diligence and strategy. And what looked like ordinary shepherding became a masterclass in divine partnership. Laban, ever the opportunist, kept changing Jacob's wages, 10 times to be exact. But every scheme backfired because God had his eye on Jacob. The man who once deceived others was now on the receiving end, but this time he responded differently. Growth isn't just seen in what we gain, but in how we handle being wronged. Jacob used selective breeding techniques, yes, literal sheep science, to multiply the strongest animals in his care. He observed patterns, adapted, and prospered. His story reminds us that wisdom is spiritual too. Prayer and planning are not enemies. Sometimes God gives revelation in spreadsheets and strategies. Don't miss this. Jacob didn't rely only on miracles. He used his mind, and God blessed that. It's a wake-up call for those waiting on doors to open without ever turning the knob. Faith doesn't cancel action, it fuels it. Jacob worked hard and trusted harder. As Jacob's flocks multiplied, so did the tension. With Laban's sons, Jealousy reared its head again. "Jacob's taking our father's wealth," they whispered. But in truth, Jacob wasn't stealing. He was stewarding. When God's favor is on you, others might call it unfair. Let them. Keep building. Here's something practical. Wherever you work, your job, business, home, treat it like Jacob treated those flocks. Be excellent. Be intentional. Be faithful. Read Proverbs 22:29. God elevates those who serve with excellence, not just charisma. Prosperity follows purpose. Even when surrounded by envy, Jacob kept his peace. Not because he was naive, but because he had divine instruction. God told him, "Go back to the land of your fathers." That word cut through the noise. It was time to move. When God speaks, you don't need everyone's approval. The more Jacob prospered, the clearer it became. His season with Laban was over, but endings are rarely smooth. Jacob had to plan his exit carefully. This wasn't just about leaving, it was about obeying. And obedience often costs comfort, but it always leads to greater purpose. Laban wasn't going to let Jacob go easily. That's how the enemy works. He resists when you start walking in freedom. But Jacob had something stronger than resistance: God's voice. It's a reminder, for us too, when it's time to shift, don't delay. Obedience is time sensitive. Jacob gathered his family, his flocks, and his courage. This wasn't just a relocation, it was a declaration. I trust God more than my current success. That's bold, because sometimes the scariest thing isn't failure, it's leaving success behind when God calls you forward. Prosperity didn't spoil Jacob, it prepared him. He had learned to work with integrity, to trust divine timing, and to lead with discernment. These weren't just riches of wealth, they were riches of wisdom, and he would need both for what came next. As the dust rose from Jacob's quiet escape, the story shifts once again. The past he left behind is chasing him, and the God who led him out is about to intervene in a way that changes everything. Jacob didn't leave Laban's house with a goodbye hug. He left in secret. Quietly, deliberately, he gathered his family, packed his blessings, and slipped away. This wasn't cowardice, it was strategy. Some seasons require a silent exit. Not everyone needs to understand your next move when God already confirmed it. Still, Jacob knew this escape would stir tension. Laban wasn't just an employer, he was family. And betrayal cuts deeper when it comes from blood. But Jacob couldn't stay bound by guilt or fear. God had called him out, and obedience often means stepping away from people who benefited from your stagnation. Laban chased him, furious. But on the way, something unexpected happened. God showed up in a dream and warned Laban, "Don't you say anything good or bad to Jacob." Just like that, divine protection covered Jacob. When God defends you, even your enemies have to tread lightly. They met face to face, tension high. Laban demanded answers, Jacob gave them. Raw, honest, unapologetic. He spoke of years of labor, sleepless nights, and constant mistreatment. It was a moment of truth. Sometimes, closure comes not with an apology, but with clarity. Laban couldn't deny Jacob's growth, nor could he control him anymore. So they drew a line, literally. A stone pillar marked their boundary. This wasn't just a peace treaty, it was a spiritual reset. Some relationships need boundaries, not bitterness. Distance can be holy. Here's something to consider. Who in your life needs a boundary, not a battle? Jacob didn't curse Laban, he released him. And that's key. Not every fight is worth your peace. Some victories come through separation, not confrontation. Wisdom knows when to walk away. God was reshaping Jacob's identity, not just through struggle, but through release. Walking away from Laban meant walking into purpose. We all have Labans, places we've outgrown, patterns we've tolerated too long. Letting go isn't loss, it's alignment. Jacob was no longer just a survivor, he was becoming a leader, a patriarch, a man carrying the weight of legacy. And God made sure his exit was sealed with peace, not war. That's divine order. When God says go, he also says, "I've got you." Though free from Laban, Jacob's past wasn't fully behind him. Ahead was Esau, the brother he deceived, the one whose anger once sent him running. This wasn't just a geographical journey. It was emotional, spiritual. God was calling Jacob not only forward, but inward. Many of us know how to move on physically, but remain stuck emotionally. Jacob's next test wouldn't be managing flocks, or dodging Laban. It would be facing the wounds he left unresolved. Healing isn't just about what you escape. It's about what you're willing to confront. The peace with Laban gave Jacob a taste of restoration. But Esau was a different storm. Still, Jacob had changed. He had grown, and he was ready to face the next chapter. Not as the deceiver, but as a man marked by grace. With every step away from Laban, Jacob stepped closer to reconciliation, not just with Esau, but with himself. And what came next would stretch his soul, test his courage, and give him a name that would echo through eternity. The night before facing Esau, Jacob found himself alone. The camp was quiet, his family across the stream, the stars blinking above. And there, in the silence, came the struggle. A man appeared. No name, no warning. Just a fight. Not physical, at first, but spiritual, emotional, divine. This was no ordinary encounter. They wrestled until dawn. Think about that. All night. No tapping out, no resting. Just relentless striving. Jacob held on, not knowing who he was fighting, but sensing that this wasn't about survival. It was about identity. And sometimes, before you step into your destiny, you have to wrestle through your doubts. This mysterious figure touched Jacob's hip and dislocated it instantly. With one move, Jacob was broken, limping, but still clinging. That's real faith, not the strength to win, but the surrender to hold on when you feel like you're losing. How many times have we mistaken breaking for failure, when it's really transformation? Jacob had spent his life manipulating outcomes. But here, he couldn't bargain or outsmart. He could only hold on. And in that grip, desperate, exhausted, humbled, he finally asked for what he really needed. A blessing. Not stolen this time. Not disguised. Just asked. That's growth. The figure asked, "What is your name?" Simple question, right? But loaded with history. Jacob had used names to deceive, to hide, to gain. This time he had to own it. Jacob, he said. The name meant trickster, supplanter. He confessed who he'd been. That's the first step to becoming who you're called to be. And then came the turning point. Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel. A new name, a new identity. Not because he fought perfectly, but because he refused to let go. God didn't rename him for being strong. He renamed him for being persistent, for wrestling until breakthrough. That night, Jacob didn't just wrestle with a stranger. He wrestled with God. He wrestled with guilt, fear, shame, and the ghosts of his past. And he left with a limp, a reminder that real encounters with God leave marks. But those marks, they make you walk differently, with humility, with reverence. Sometimes God lets the struggle continue not to punish us, but to purify us, to pull out the false strength we've leaned on. Jacob needed to face himself before he could face Esau. And maybe, just maybe, so do we. Reflection is part of redemption. Here's something to try. Take a day this week and get alone, really alone. No phone, no noise, just you and God. Journal, pray, wrestle. Ask honest questions. Bring your full self to the table. Don't fake it. He already sees it. But when you bring it willingly, transformation begins. Jacob walked away with a new name and a new walk. Limping, yes, but leading. Broken, but blessed. That's the paradox of grace. We think God wants our strength, but he often moves most in our surrender. The ones who limp with God often lead with wisdom. That moment by the river wasn't just personal, it was prophetic. Israel was born that night, a nation in the body of a man. And what came next would prove that the new Jacob wasn't just different. In name, he was different in nature. Because the dawn was rising, Esau was approaching, and Jacob, now Israel, was finally ready to face the brother he once fled. The sun rose on a new day, but also on a new Jacob, now called Israel. Limping from his divine encounter, he looked up and saw Esau approaching with 400 men. Not exactly the welcome party you hoped for. Every step closer stirred old fears. Would Esau still want revenge? Was this the end, or a new beginning? Jacob didn't hide. He didn't send servants ahead to do his dirty work. He walked to the front of his family line, bowed 7 times, and humbled himself. No pride, no deception, just repentance. This wasn't about defending the past. It was about making peace in the present. And that takes courage. Esau ran toward him, not with a sword, but with open arms. He embraced Jacob, kissed him, and they both wept. Tears did what years couldn't. Forgiveness broke through. This story reminds us that reconciliation isn't always earned. It's sometimes given. Grace has a way of disarming even the hardest hearts. Imagine carrying guilt for years only to be met with grace. That's what Jacob felt. And that's what many of us fear won't happen. But this moment shows what's possible when God softens hearts. Never underestimate the power of time, healing, and divine timing. Jacob tried to give Esau gifts, livestock, wealth, peace offerings, but Esau said, "I have enough." Sometimes the people we think hate us have also grown, healed, and moved on. Not everyone is stuck in the past, and maybe, just maybe, you're not the villain in their head anymore. Still, Jacob insisted, not out of guilt, but gratitude. Giving was his way of honoring Esau and sealing the peace. There's something holy about repairing broken relationships with generosity, not just in things, but in attitude. When the heart is soft, the hands follow. This reunion didn't just restore a family, it protected a legacy. Because if Esau had chosen vengeance, history would have changed. But through grace, the path stayed aligned with God's promise. Reconciliation isn't just personal, it can be prophetic. One act of forgiveness can shape generations. Jacob's words to Esau are striking. Seeing your face is like seeing the face of God. Whoa, that's deep. He wasn't exaggerating. He had just wrestled with God and survived, and now he had faced his greatest fear and found mercy. Sometimes, people become mirrors of divine mercy. Not every wound heals quickly, and not every reunion will look like this one. But Jacob and Esau show us that enemies can become brothers again, that fear can give way to peace, and that what once was broken doesn't have to stay that way forever. Here's something to consider. Who's your Esau? Who do you need to face, not with excuses, but with humility? Maybe it's a parent, a friend, or even yourself. Write them a letter, even if you never send it. Let forgiveness start somewhere. Healing is never passive. It's a choice. Esau and Jacob didn't walk the rest of the journey together. They went separate ways. And that's okay. Forgiveness doesn't always mean full restoration. Sometimes it means peace at a distance. What matters is the release, the closure, the grace exchanged. With the past finally behind him, Jacob walked forward. But peace wasn't the only thing waiting ahead. There were more altars to build, more losses to face, and a deep spiritual shift just around the bend. After reconciling with Esau, Jacob didn't just resume life, he redirected it. God called him to return to Bethel, the place where it all began, the place where he first encountered heaven on earth, and Jacob obeyed. This wasn't nostalgia, it was spiritual reset. When things feel uncertain, go back to where you last heard God clearly. Before the journey, Jacob called his household to purify themselves. Bury the idols, change the garments, start fresh. It was more than an outward ritual, it was an inward realignment. Sometimes we need to declutter our souls before we can move forward. Sacred journeys require sacred preparation. He built an altar in Bethel and worshipped. No manipulation, no crisis, no bargaining, just praise. That moment marked a shift. Jacob was no longer just reacting to life, he was responding to God. Worship wasn't a tool to get something, it became the center of everything. In that holy place, God appeared again and reaffirmed the promise. You will be a great nation, kings will come from you. A powerful reminder that divine calling doesn't expire with your mistakes. God repeated what he said years ago, not because he forgot, but because Jacob needed to remember. But this chapter of Jacob's story wasn't all glory. It was also grief. On the road from Bethel, tragedy struck. Rachel, the love of his life, died during childbirth. Just as life was being born, life was also being taken. That paradox of joy and sorrow often walks side by side. Jacob named the boy Benjamin, son of my right hand, though Rachel had called him Benoni, son of my sorrow. It's a reminder that we have the power to rename our pain. We can choose how the loss shapes the legacy. Faith doesn't deny grief, it reframes it. He buried Rachel on the road, not in a palace, but by a tree. No grand funeral, just raw loss. And yet, even in mourning, Jacob moved forward. Sometimes healing isn't loud, it's steady. A quiet decision to keep walking when your heart wants to stop. Not long after, Jacob faced another loss. His father, Isaac, passed away. The man who had blessed him, who once doubted his voice, was now gone. And together, Jacob and Esau buried their father. Another sign that healing had done its work. Old wounds didn't stop them from honoring legacy. Grief has a way of maturing us. Jacob's tears weren't signs of weakness. They were proof of depth. Spiritual renewal often comes wrapped in loss. Not because God causes pain, but because pain breaks what pride can't touch. It opens the heart in ways success never could. Here's something practical. If you're grieving, don't rush it. Create space for memory, for mourning, for healing. Read the Psalms, write out your prayers, talk to someone you trust. God is not just present in joy. He's especially close to the brokenhearted. Jacob came to Bethel as one man and left as something more. A patriarch marked by faith, pain, and a deeper awareness of God's presence. His story was shaped not only by what he gained, but also by what he lost. And both were holy. Yet even as Jacob rebuilt his altar and buried his beloved, the story wasn't slowing down. Because a storm of betrayal was forming within his own household, and the son he loved most was about to vanish from sight. Just when peace seemed to settle over Jacob's life, the cycle of favoritism returned, this time through Joseph, the son of Rachel. Jacob loved him deeply, and he didn't hide it. That colorful robe wasn't just a garment, it was a statement, a symbol of affection. And just like before, favoritism stirred resentment. Joseph's brothers watched with burning eyes as their father praised him, protected him, and gave him dreams. Literal dreams, visions of authority and greatness. But instead of inspiring them, it threatened them. Old wounds reopened. Sibling rivalry wasn't history, it was happening all over again. Jacob didn't mean to cause division, but love without balance often does. He had lived through favoritism as a child, yet now he unknowingly passed it on. It's a warning to all of us. Unhealed patterns tend to repeat themselves, and what we excuse as love can become someone else's pain. Joseph's dreams were divine, but his delivery was unfiltered. He told his brothers they'd bow to him, and they snapped. The mix of youth, vision, and immaturity was explosive. Be careful who you share your calling with. Not everyone will cheer for what God shows you in secret, the brothers plotted. First, to kill, then to cover. They threw Joseph into a pit, stripped him of his robe, and sold him into slavery. And just like that, Jacob's favored son was gone. Betrayed not by enemies, but by blood. Sometimes the deepest wounds come from those closest to us. They returned home with a lie soaked in goat's blood, holding the torn robe. A wild animal devoured him, they said. Jacob's heart shattered. The very thing he had used to elevate Joseph, the robe, now became the evidence of his supposed death. What once was a gift became a ghost. Jacob mourned inconsolably. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. No comfort could reach him. He had known loss before, but this pain cut deeper. It was grief mixed with guilt. The fear that maybe his love had marked Joseph for suffering, that maybe his choices had caused this. Meanwhile, Joseph's story continued, far from Jacob's sight. Sold into Egypt, stripped of identity, but not of destiny. And though Jacob didn't know it yet, God was still working. Sometimes what looks like the end is just the beginning of a bigger plan. Favoritism isn't always loud. It can be subtle, hidden in glances, tone, or silent expectations. This chapter invites us to examine our relationships. Are we showing love equally? Are we healing the patterns we once hated? Reflection is hard, but necessary. Here's a challenge. Write down the names of those closest to you. Ask yourself, do they know they're equally valued? If not, start today. A word, a gesture, an honest conversation can shift the atmosphere. Jacob's story teaches us that favoritism doesn't need to be intentional to be impactful. Jacob grieved for Joseph. The story took a darker turn. One son lost, many hearts hardened, and a family shaken. But beneath the silence of sorrow, God was orchestrating redemption. Because what man meant for evil, God was about to use for something far greater. Years passed. Joseph was gone, at least in Jacob's eyes. But life didn't stop. The land faced famine, a slow and merciless wave that dried up the ground and threatened the promise God had made. Jacob, now older and wearier, had to act. And so, he sent his sons to Egypt in search of food. Little did he know, the boy he once grieved was now the man holding the keys to provision. Joseph, once sold as a slave, now stood as second in command over Egypt. But Jacob didn't recognize the providence in motion. Sometimes God answers prayers with people we thought were lost. The brothers returned with grain and questions. Joseph had recognized them, tested them, and demanded they bring Benjamin, Jacob's youngest. Jacob was torn. He'd already lost Joseph. Could he risk another son? Faith is hardest when it asks you to release what you're afraid to lose. Reluctantly, Jacob agreed. "If I am bereaved, I am bereaved," he said. It wasn't resignation, it was surrender. A moment of deep trust. When the situation is out of your hands, it's finally in God's. That's where miracles often begin. As Benjamin journeyed to Egypt, so did the winds of restoration. Joseph, moved by love and divine timing, finally revealed himself to his brothers. What followed was tears, reunion, and reconciliation. And word was sent back: Joseph is alive. Imagine Jacob hearing that. A father's hope revived in one impossible sentence. He was stunned, silent at first. But when he saw the wagons Joseph had sent, his spirit revived. That detail matters. God often confirms his promises with tangible signs. When hope feels too fragile to believe, look for the wagons. Those little reminders that he's still writing your story. Jacob prepared to leave Canaan and head to Egypt. But before moving, he stopped in Beersheba to worship. That pause matters. Before big transitions, wise people seek divine confirmation. In the stillness, God spoke. "Don't be afraid. I will go down with you." That's all Jacob needed to hear. The journey wasn't easy, but it was covered. 70 members of Jacob's family entered Egypt, carrying history, hope, and healing. What once was broken was now moving together, toward preservation. God didn't just restore Joseph, he redeemed the entire household. And here's the twist. What was meant to kill them, famine, became the bridge to their future. God used crisis to relocate them into promise. That's how divine provision works. It doesn't always look like abundance at first. It often begins with desperation. Sometimes, famine forces movement. Discomfort opens doors. If you're in a dry season, don't panic. Ask God what he's trying to lead you toward. What looks like lack may be a disguised invitation to more. Trust the process, even when it's hidden in hunger. Jacob's journey to Egypt wasn't just a relocation, it was prophecy in motion. Centuries earlier, God told Abraham his descendants would go to a foreign land. Now it was happening, not by force, but by divine design. The story was bigger than one man. It was shaping a nation. And as Jacob approached the land of Pharaoh, heart full, spirit revived, and family restored, he had no idea that the final chapter of his life would be one of peace, prophecy, and legacy that would echo far beyond Egypt. Egypt wasn't Canaan, but for Jacob, it became a place of unexpected peace. After a lifetime of conflict, deception, and sorrow, he now found rest in the arms of providence. Reunited with Joseph, the son he thought was dead, Jacob's heart finally exhaled. This wasn't just reunion, it was restoration. Pharaoh welcomed Jacob with honor. Imagine that, a foreign shepherd blessing the most powerful man in the world. But Jacob wasn't just any man. He carried the promise of God. And sometimes, the favor on your life opens doors that status alone never could. Blessings flow from identity, not position. Jacob lived 17 more years in Egypt. 17 years of peace, family, and reflection. After all the running, the wrestling, the waiting, he finally had stillness. But he didn't waste that peace. He used it to pour into the next generation. Legacy isn't built in chaos, it's built in calm. Before his death, Jacob called Joseph to his side and made a request. "Don't bury me in Egypt. Take me back to the land of my fathers." Even in comfort, Jacob remembered the covenant. Egypt was a blessing, but Canaan was the promise. That's vision, seeing beyond your current comfort. Then came the blessings. One by one, Jacob gathered his sons and grandsons. But these weren't casual words, they were prophetic declarations. He spoke over their futures, their struggles, and their strengths. Each word carried weight. Parents, take note. Your words shape destinies. He blessed Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, as his own, but in a twist of hands, he crossed his arms, placing the greater blessing on the younger, Ephraim. Joseph tried to correct him, but Jacob stood firm. He had learned that God often chooses the unexpected. Sound familiar? Through those blessings, Jacob wasn't just speaking, he was sowing. Into tribes, into futures, into generations he would never meet. That's what legacy does. It reaches beyond your lifetime. The words you speak today may be the strength someone carries tomorrow. Here's something practical. Take time to bless those around you. Not just have a good day, but speak life, purpose, and truth into them. Especially your children, your spouse, your friends. Be intentional. Jacob's story reminds us that a single blessing can echo for centuries. Jacob's final days weren't marked by regret, but by fulfillment. He had made peace with Esau. He had been reunited with Joseph, and he had passed on the promise, not perfectly, but faithfully, and that's what matters. God doesn't demand perfection. He honors perseverance. As his time drew near, Jacob pulled his feet onto the bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. Simple words, but packed with purpose. He didn't die defeated. He died full of years, of stories, of faith. A man who started as Jacob, but ended as Israel. Egypt mourned him with great honor. But his sons fulfilled his final wish. They carried him back to Canaan, to rest beside Abraham and Isaac, back to the land of the covenant. Because promises may be delayed, but they're never forgotten. God always finishes what he starts. Yet, even as the dust settled over Jacob's tomb, the story wasn't over. A new generation was rising, and though the patriarch was gone, the promise was alive, ready to stretch beyond borders, beyond empires, and into the unfolding plan of God. Jacob's final breath may have left his body, but it ignited something far greater, a legacy. His story didn't end with death. It expanded through it. 17 years in Egypt gave him time not just to live, but to prepare. He didn't just fade away. He finished intentionally, with faith and foresight. His sons carried him back to Canaan, just as he'd asked. They didn't understand everything, but they honored the man who had wrestled with God, walked through valleys, and spoken over their futures. That act alone turned mourning into mission. When you honor legacy, you align with destiny. Jacob was buried in the cave of Machpelah alongside Abraham and Isaac. 3 generations of covenant, resting in the same soil. That tomb wasn't just a burial site, it was a prophecy in stone, a reminder that God's promises outlive people. The story continues even when the storyteller rests. Grief hit hard, especially for Joseph. He had gained his father back after years of loss, only to lose him again. But this time, it was different. There was closure. There was peace. And with that came the weight of carrying on the name of Israel, not just in title, but in responsibility. After the funeral, Joseph's brothers feared revenge. What if Joseph pays us back now that Dad is gone? Guilt still whispered, even after years of blessing. But Joseph, now matured by grace, wept and said, "What you meant for evil, God meant for good." That one sentence became the anthem of redemption. Jacob's legacy wasn't perfect. It was human, raw, and real. But it was also saturated with faith. His journey from deceiver to Israel reminds us that God is patient with process, that even flawed lives can produce holy fruit. That identity isn't fixed, it's transformed through encounters. We often think legacy is built in great acts, but Jacob's came through wrestling, waiting, blessing, and believing. He wasn't famous for slaying giants or parting seas. He was known for perseverance, for holding on, for being willing to walk with a limp if it meant walking with God. Legacy lives in the people we impact, in the prayers whispered over sleeping children, in the sacrifices made quietly, in the forgiveness offered, even when it hurts. Jacob's sons became tribes, his name became a nation, and his limp, it became a mark of divine encounter. Here's something to reflect on. What are you building that will outlast you? Are your words planting seeds? Is your character worth inheriting? You don't have to be famous to leave a mark. You just have to be faithful with your part in the story. Jacob's life ended in Egypt, but his legacy led Israel out of it. Generations later, Moses would rise, and the people would march. Not because of a new promise, but because of an old one. One given to a man who wrestled in the dark and came out renamed. This is more than biography. It's blueprint. A map of what it means to trust God in the mess, to grow through struggle, and to die full of faith. Jacob's story invites us to wrestle, to walk, to worship, and to live for something far beyond ourselves. And so, with the dust of Canaan beneath him and the promise of God above him, Jacob's chapter ends. But the book? It's far from over. Because from his bones, a nation would rise, and through his line, the world would one day meet the one true king. Now that you've walked through Jacob's journey, the wrestling, the wandering, the revelations, let me ask you something. What part of his story feels like yours? Is it the family dysfunction? The guilt you can't shake? The waiting for something bigger? Because here's the truth. God didn't choose Jacob because he was flawless. He chose him because he was willing to wrestle, to grow, to return. And that same God is calling you to do the same. Not to be perfect, but to be present in the process. So what's stopping you from building your own legacy? What excuses are you holding on to that God's been asking you to let go of? If you've been waiting for a sign to turn your life around, this is it. Start praying again. Start dreaming again. Start walking, even if you limp. And before you go, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because there's so much more to discover about people like Jacob and the God who transforms them.